Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. You'll notice the Jeep looks a little bit different from the last video. I've been a bit busy in here. I've got all of the engine torn apart. It's on the stand here. And what I want to do is just walk you through the status of this engine, what the conrod bearings look like, what the main bearings look like. And I've pulled off the timing cover, the timing chain. And I also wanted to give you a few tips on if you plan to do this job yourself, just to save you some headache. And yeah, so let's get to it, and I will show you breaking apart this engine and what's going on inside of it. All right, so I have the oil pan off, and I can see why it was making so much noise. You can see that kind of like grayish haze on there. That's all metal flake. It smells like metallic-y. And if you look here, you can see on the lighting's not quite as good over here, but on the oil pickup tube, it's full of metal. I'm gonna pop these off and take a look at the bearings. Where did I put the tool? There it is. All right, so I have all of the caps out, and you'll notice there are 5 bearings here. This one's pretty bad, very bad. This one is not quite as bad, and the rest are, they all tell the same story. There was very little oil pressure, and they're not great. But the last one, you'll notice I said 5. The last one here spun. So this did have a spun rod bearing, and it's cracked right there. If it'll focus, there we go. So yeah, the next steps will be getting that crank out, and then I'm gonna start disassembling probably the oil pump, wrap that up safely, get the crank damper off because I just replaced this recently, and any other engine parts that even if I do swap in another engine, I would want to swap over to that engine before I put in. So I've pulled off the main bearing caps and the crank damper along with the timing cover to show the timing chain. And just wanted to show you the amount of play that's in it after 250,000 miles. All right, so I have the timing chain off, and the crank is ready to come out. So one thing I would recommend, which will come in handy for me later when I get a used engine probably, and fit that up with a new timing chain, is if you're going to take apart the oil pan, you're going to look at the bearings on the conrods and the main bearings, definitely take off the timing first, because I took off the conrod bearings and I just had to fiddle with the pistons getting in the way of the rotating assembly. So, wasn't a big deal. I just had to move them out of the way as it rotated to line these up and take it off. But yeah, if you're going to do it yourself and you're going to start over, definitely do the timing first. But anyways, let's get this out and I'll show you the main bearings. Now everything's out on the bench. I'll walk you through the main bearings and this timing chain over here, and show you all of the crime scene basically that's been created here by all the lack of oil pressure. So at the front, it's actually surprisingly not that bad. Not too much scoring, and the scoring that's there is quite shallow. Moving to the second one, it's really bad. Probably the worst of the lot, and lots of debris must have entered in there. Moving towards the middle where the oil pump lies, it's not quite as bad, which you would expect. And all the way back, right before the main seal, you can see there's two really deep grooves in there. The timing chain was very stretched. I showed you that on the engine itself, but you can also see, I don't mind putting that there because I'm not going to be reusing it. You can also see on the timing cover, it actually broke off a piece of this timing chain tensioner or guide. It's not really a tensioner per se, but it will keep the chain off of it if it does start to sag. But it's gone so far that it broke off this little piece, and there's a little bit of a scoring mark here from where it was rubbing. So if you're following along on this series, I imagine you probably have a good understanding of how an engine builds oil pressure. But if you don't, I wanted to give a quick explanation and show why this engine has failed so miserably, and how I'm going to fix it and what it should be doing, basically. So you'll see on this main bearing cap, there is a hole which corresponds to an oil galley within the engine block. So that hole is fed by this oil pump with a screen. And what that does is when it forces that oil in, it creates a very thin film that builds between the two bearing surfaces and the crank journal. So with that, if you have a thin film of oil, you're not ever contacting these points other than a cold start where the pump needs time to circulate that oil around. So what's happened is when I sunk this Jeep, all the oil gummed up in the bottom of the pan, and it plugged this pickup tube for the oil pump, which meant that that film could not be created between the two surfaces. Now with that, you get these two metal-to-metal contacts, and what that does is generates all sorts of debris, as you saw in the engine. And when you have that debris, you get these kind of scoring marks. And it's kind of a slippery slope, because when you get those scoring marks, you increase the clearances, and then it just gets worse and worse, more debris, increases the clearances, and then you get stuff that happens like my rod bearings that spin. And when they spin, then they gum up the whole crank surface, and now you're in for a lot of damage. So that didn't happen on any of the main bearings, thankfully, but if I kept running it how it was, it definitely would have. So that's my quick explanation for you, and with those clearances restored, you can generate that film of oil, which will keep your engine happy. So I did want to give a few tips of what I learned while pulling this out, which will be very quick. First of all, these two holes house an E12 Torx bit, but you have to drop this transmission down to get access to them, and even with it dropped down, there's very little room. So that's just something to look out for. It will be kind of a pain in the ass. But the biggest thing is, and there's two things with it being lifted that you have to look out for. One is you'll notice that the front clip is taken off. This may be self-explanatory, but the past times I've pulled engines, I've never done that because it's just come out the front. And but since this has a 4.5-inch lift and 33s, the engine hoist actually was almost maxed out, and I still couldn't get it out, so I just had to tear this out. And it was actually very easy. You just walk the whole crane back, and happy days. But the other thing with it being lifted is I had this jack about fully all the way up to get this transmission jacked up so I could take out the cross member that holds it in. And now it's not all the way up, but even if I do max out the jack, it will not return to the chassis rail. And that's because, of course, I've taken out the engine with all that weight, the suspension's decompressed, and now it's higher off the ground. So just be wary of that. Put an extra block of wood underneath the transmission pan so you still have enough room to compensate for the vehicle being lifted up. So another thing I want to discuss is on this fuel rail here. When you're moving this out of the way, just be very careful. These go down to some flexible lines, and you'll see I kinked this and it's now leaking, which isn't a huge deal. I'll just cut this off, put a new flex line on it, but it's just one more thing that I have to do now. So be very careful moving these out of the way. I believe on the newer Jeeps, anything 97 plus, it has a returnless fuel system, so you only have to worry about one of these fuel lines getting kinked, but just something to know. So one last generic tip is I always like to, whenever I can, when I take out a fastener, I always put it back in the locating hole that it was in before. This just helps you not lose fasteners, and when you're putting it back together, you don't end up with that big handful of extra bolts that you don't know where they go to. So you'll see I've trying to grouped everything together here. This is all the oil pan bolts. Put everything, especially internal engine parts. This is just out of force of habit to put it on a towel to keep all the debris, and especially working on the Jeep that has all this mud, you want to keep them clean. I'm not going to be reusing these, so not a huge deal, but I still like to put it on a nice towel or shop rag or something. But yes, always try and keep your fasteners together. Just put the bolts back through the holes, and it makes your life a whole lot easier when you go to put it back together. All right, so back to the state that it was at the beginning of the video. I'm going to cut it here just so I don't make this video too painfully long. And I will see you next time when I get my new engine, hopefully. And I do the quick little refresh and throw it back in the Jeep and hopefully get it running. So, yeah, thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next video.